Welcome to the Deep Dive. Sometimes global events just feel like they shift the very ground beneath our feet, completely redefining entire regions. Today, we're going to try and cut through some of the noise surrounding one of those moments. The huge escalation in the Iran-Israel conflict. For decades, this whole thing was basically a shadow war, right? Fought with proxies, covert ops, but then June 2025 happened, and everything changed. It just exploded into open, direct military conflict. We've pulled together various essays, news reports, trying to give you a clear, concise understanding of how this unprecedented turning point actually came about, what exactly went down, and crucially, what the fallout, the implications are. All right, so let's dig into this. For decades, like we said, this conflict simmered, mostly out of sight, proxies, covert stuff, but something fundamentally shifted in June 2025. Can you maybe walk us through the history that led up to this?
Absolutely. I mean, the roots go way back. You really have to look at the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That's when Iran became an Islamic republic, which was, vehemently opposed to Israel from the get-go. Diplomatic ties were cut immediately. And from then on, Iran's foreign policy heavily involved supporting anti-Israel groups, proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. That became a cornerstone.
And Israel, of course, wasn't passive. They were running their own operations, weren't they? Trying to counter that Iranian influence. We're talking cyber attacks, assassinations, military strikes.
Exactly. Covert operations were Israel's main tool for years. Think back to 2010, the Stuxnet virus. That was reportedly Israel targeting Iran's nuclear centrifuges. Big deal at the time. And then more recently, say between 2018 and 2021, you had multiple incidents where Israel was accused of attacks on Iranian nuclear scientists, on facilities. The goal seemed to be degrading Iran's capabilities, especially the nuclear program, without, sparking a full-blown war. Keep it in the shadows.
Right, keeping it contained. But the lines started getting blurry, didn't they? Even those big strikes back in October 2024, Iran's Operation True Promise II, which was retaliation for assassinations, involved lots of missiles and drones. Even that was sort of framed within the old rules, right?
That's a really key point. True Promise II was a major escalation, no doubt. Very worrying. But both sides still seem to treat it as, let's say, an unusually intense round within the Shadow War's sort of unwritten rules. It was a serious flare-up, definitely. But the fundamental idea of avoiding open state-on-state warfare held, that lasted until June 2025. That's when, as one source put it, the whole guise of Shadow War collapsed. The game completely changed.
Okay, let's unpack this. June 2025, the guise collapses. What happened first?
It kicked off with Israel's Operation Rising Lion, June 13th.
Rising Lion. And what did that involve?
This was a major air campaign. I mean, really significant scale. They hit Iran's main nuclear facilities, Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, used powerful bunker buster munitions, apparently. But it wasn't just nuclear sites. They also targeted IRGC command centers, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, plus air defense systems, ballistic missile infrastructure. And this was across multiple cities, Tehran, Isfahan, Kermanshah, Tabriz, plus military bases near them. It was widespread.
Wow. So comprehensive doesn't really cover it. What was the reported impact of those first Israeli strikes?
Pretty devastating from the reports. Senior IRGC and Quds Force commanders killed, nuclear scientists too, and importantly, they seem to have damaged heavily shielded underground facilities, which is a major blow to the nuclear program.
And there was a cyber element too.
Yes, that's a crucial part. Alongside the airstrikes, there were reports of major cyber sabotage campaigns. Mossad, allegedly using covert drone teams on the ground somehow, managed to disable Iranian air defenses and missile launchers. So it wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about degrading Iran's ability to effectively retaliate right away. A coordinated, multi-pronged attack.
Got it. Okay. So Israel strikes hard. How did Iran respond to Operation True Promise 3, right?
That's right. Iran's retaliation came quickly, starting pretty much immediately from June 13th through to the 16th. They called it Operation True Promise 3. They launched multiple waves, salvos of ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel.
And the impact in Israel.
It was significant. Reports indicated over 1,000 injuries, maybe more, and sadly over 100 fatalities. And what was particularly alarming and drew a lot of international focus was that many of these missiles and drones seemed to hit civilian areas. Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, other cities too. Bat Yam, Rehovot, Bnei Brak were mentioned.
There was that one specific incident at the hospital, wasn't there, that really made headlines?
Yes, exactly. On June 19th, a Sagil ballistic missile hit the Soroka Medical Center in Beersheba. Dozens injured, forced evacuations. Israel immediately classified that as a war crime. Huge international condemnation followed. And beyond the direct attacks, Iran also started making threats, closing the Strait of Hormuz, targeting Western military assets in the region. That obviously caused major jitters, especially in global markets.
Okay, so direct state-on-state strikes, civilian areas hit, threats escalating, and then the U.S. steps in. This feels like the next major turning point, June 21st, 22nd.
Absolutely. The U.S. intervention was a game changer. It dramatically altered the calculus, brought in a whole new level of risk, and really shifted the power dynamic visibly. So yeah, June 21st, 22nd, the United States, under President Trump at the time, joined the strikes. They conducted airstrikes specifically targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, again, Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan. They used bunker busters, too. And the U.S. claimed they achieved complete destruction of those sites.
And President Trump mentioned regime change. How serious was that, and how did Iran react to the U.S. getting directly involved militarily?
He did float that idea, yes, regime change. Though other U.S. officials later walked that back a bit, emphasizing that the civilian leadership wasn't the primary target. It seemed more like rhetorical pressure, perhaps. The U.S. approach was initially somewhat restrained, despite the strikes, but they made it very clear. If Iran escalated further, they'd get more involved. Iran's reaction was, well, interesting. Supreme Leader Khamenei came out, strongly condemned the strikes, promised retaliation, but notably against Israel. He seemed to conspicuously avoid mentioning the U.S. directly in that threat.
That is interesting, a potential signal.
Some analysts thought so, yeah. Maybe leaving a tiny crack open for future diplomacy, or perhaps just focusing ire on the regional adversary. Hard to say for sure. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, was much more direct. He warned U.S. involvement would be very dangerous for everybody, and significantly, he pulled Iran out of any nuclear negotiations, which were basically dead in the water anyway by that point.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S. intervention dramatically altered the calculus, introducing a new level of risk and a shift in the perceived power dynamics. So this isn't just about the fighting itself, it's a fundamental rebalancing of power, right? How did this change the whole security picture in the region? Israel's advantage, Iran's standing.
Yeah, that's the core of it. You know, for decades, that shadow boxing, as you called it, let both sides build up capabilities without showing their full hand. But the moment that cover vanished in June 2025, the underlying military superiority, especially with U.S. backing, just became blindingly obvious. Before this, Israel had a covert edge, sure. Intelligence, specific ops, but these joint Israeli-U.S. strikes, that created overt military dominance for Israel. Iran's air defenses, its nuclear infrastructure severely degraded. The advantage is now out in the open, undeniable.
And the ripple effects. What about Iran's influence through its proxies and what's happening inside Iran itself?
Well, that regional influence has taken a serious hit. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Assad in Syria, Iran's key partners or proxies, their leverage is reduced. They're weakened. Domestically, this is probably Iran's biggest crisis since the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. Think about it. Losing senior military figures, scientists, major infrastructure damage, civilian casualties. It fuels internal unrest, erodes the regime's legitimacy. This conflict puts Tehran in a really tough spot. Their military options are drastically reduced. Do they stick to the revolutionary defiance and risk more devastating losses? Or do they look for some kind of diplomatic way out, even if it compromises their core ideology? It's almost an existential question for them. And we saw tangible signs of fear, too. That reported mass exodus from Tehran, maybe over 100,000 people fleeing the capital, that puts huge strain on logistics and shows real panic setting in among the population.
Right, that image of people fleeing Tehran really brings home the internal pressure. And then there's the global economic impact. You mentioned jitters earlier.
Yeah, immediate and global. Oil prices jumped over 10%, hitting highs we hadn't seen since January, all driven by fears about the Strait of Hormuz, that critical shipping lane. Stock markets dropped pretty much everywhere. And as you expect in times like these, money flowed into safe haven assets, gold, the Swiss franc, people looking for security.
So we've got the strategic shifts, the economic fallout, but this raises an important question. Beyond the military moves, what's the actual human cost here? And what about international law?
The human cost is, frankly, immense. Thousands wounded on both sides. Reports suggested around 3,000 injured in Iran, hundreds killed since June 13th. Israel reported about 24 deaths, over 200 hospitalizations. It's devastating for the people caught in the middle. A stark reminder of the price paid for these strategic decisions.
And the strain on healthcare must be enormous. That strike on the Soroka Hospital in Beersheba really highlighted the vulnerability of civilian infrastructure, didn't it?
Absolutely. Israeli hospitals were reported to be overloaded, and the Soroka incident specifically caused international outrage. Israel called it a war crime. Inside Iran, the situation sounds even worse. Mass displacement, widespread damage, internet shutdowns disrupting communication, health services struggling. It deepens the humanitarian crisis significantly. And you're right to bring up international law. Strikes on hospitals, schools, residential areas, even embassies. These all raise very serious questions under international humanitarian law. Is enough being done to distinguish between military and civilian targets? The UN Secretary General called for restraint. Western diplomats demanded accountability, expressed grave concern. But the core issue is adherence to the laws of war on the ground.
How did the world react more broadly? What was the line from, say, European powers?
Europe, Germany, France, the UK, they consistently pushed for de-escalation. They urged a return to diplomacy. And importantly, they stated opposition to the idea of regime change in Iran. The UN, the Red Cross, their focus was clearly on protecting civilians, ensuring humanitarian access. Basic humanitarian principles.
And what about other key players? Russia, China?
Their reactions were somewhat predictable, perhaps. Russia condemned the Western strikes. They even hinted, maybe provocatively, at potential nuclear support for Iran and offered to mediate. China also called for a ceasefire, for dialogue. They warned against violating international law, stressing stability, which is usually China's main line in these situations. And then you had North Korea, Pakistan, various Iranian proxies. They all lined up to condemn the actions by Israel and the U.S.
Okay, so geopolitically, how does this leave the proxy networks versus the formal alliances?
Well, Iran's proxy network, Hezbollah, Houthis, etc. It's definitely weakened, but it's not gone. They're still capable of launching attacks, causing disruption. Hybrid warfare is still an option for them. Israel, on the other hand, has its strong alliance with the U.S. now very visibly activated. Plus, those Abraham Accords partnerships with some Arab states provide a degree of regional backing, though the extent of practical support might vary. But even with its advantages, Israel faces risks, right? A prolonged conflict means operational fatigue, resource drain, maybe increasing international criticism. It's not a guaranteed win long term.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. Strategically, Israel seems to have the upper hand right now, air superiority, intelligence, U.S. backing. But what are the potential downsides or long-term risks for them?
Yeah, tactically and strategically, they're in a stronger position. But the risks are real. You mentioned operational fatigue. How long can they sustain this intensity? There's the risk of global condemnation, especially over civilian casualties. There's political fragility at home, too. Wars can be unifying, but protracted conflicts can also expose divisions. And crucially, there's the unpredictable factor of Iran's proxies. Hezbollah, for example, could still inflict significant pain, even if they can't win a conventional war. So translating battlefield gains into lasting security isn't straightforward.
And flipping that, what about Iran? Their military options look severely limited now. What paths are realistically open to Tehran?
Their options are definitely narrower. The direct military confrontation has been disastrous for them. So what's left? Maybe symbolic retaliation, small-scale stuff to show they're still fighting? Or, and this is the big question, do the internal pressures, the unrest, the economic pain, the sheer scale of the losses force them towards seeking some kind of negotiation? The regime's survival instinct is strong, so they're caught between that revolutionary ideology that demands defiance and the harsh reality that continued conflict might threaten the regime itself. It could push them towards concession or maybe just digging in for a long, painful stalemate.
And the U.S. role?
Yeah.
Obviously, it ramped up the conflict, but does it also maybe create space for de-escalation or containment down the line?
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? U.S. involvement clearly intensified things, raised the stakes massively, but it probably also acted as a major deterrent against further Iranian escalation, like closing Hormuz or major attacks on U.S. assets. Looking ahead, any diplomatic efforts will likely have to focus on basic crisis containment, maybe trying to get some kind of nuclear oversight back in place, but reviving anything like the old JCPOA deal. After these direct U.S.-Iran strikes, that seems incredibly difficult. The trust deficit is just enormous now.
So where does this leave us? What comes next? Are we just going to see more fighting, maybe climbing the escalation ladder further?
It's certainly possible. All sides have made threats about further strikes. There's talk of targeting American, British, French assets. The risk of miscalculation, something going wrong and triggering an even bigger response is terrifyingly high. The military option is still very much on the table.
Is anyone seriously pushing for diplomatic off-ramps? Are there actual talks happening?
Well, the Europeans are trying. They're pushing for new avenues for nuclear talks, for de-escalation, but Iran's public stance is rigid. No talks until the Israeli and U.S. strikes stop completely. It feels a bit like a stalemate diplomatically. Who blinks first? It's hard to see a clear path forward right now.
And the risk of it spreading. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Syria, could they widen the conflict?
That's a constant worry, yes. These groups have acted in line with Iran's goals before. A major flare-up involving Hezbollah, for instance, could really broaden the battlefield and draw Lebanon, maybe others, deeper into the conflict. It's a very real danger.
And meanwhile, the humanitarian pleas continue. Calls for ceasefires, aid access.
Yes, those calls are persistent from the UN, from aid agencies, ceasefires, safe corridors for civilians, protection for hospitals. The basic needs are urgent. But the bigger question looms. What about long-term stability? If there's no diplomatic breakthrough soon, the region risks deeper fragmentation, continued economic chaos, volatile oil markets, maybe more arms proliferation as everyone tries to get stronger, and potentially a much larger refugee crisis. The consequences could be vast and long-lasting.
So to wrap up, this June 2025 Iran-Israel war, it really is an unprecedented turning point. We've moved from decades of shadowy skirmishes to direct, overt warfare between major regional powers with global players involved.
That's the reality. Right now, Israel and the U.S. seem to hold the tactical advantage. Iran's options look limited, maybe narrowing, but escalation is still dangerously easy, and the human cost just keeps climbing: casualties, displacement, the strike on the hospital. It's a brutal situation, and diplomacy is really struggling to find traction.
It really makes you think. This crisis isn't just about redrawing power maps in the Middle East. It feels like it's testing global rules about war, about protecting people, about managing nuclear dangers. So a few things for you, the listener, to consider. Can Israel actually turn these military successes into some kind of lasting peace? Or will the conflict just grind on? Will Iran be backed into a corner and forced to negotiate? Or will defiance win out, leading to more conflict? And maybe the biggest question, can diplomacy, even though it seems stalled right now, actually pull things back from the brink of a wider regional war that could reshape the Middle East for generations? Because without serious de-escalation, without credible talks, maybe including getting nuclear inspectors back in this conflict, really does risk metastasizing. It could redraw the whole security landscape for years, maybe decades to come.